Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Energy Technology. I'm Jackie Park, Editor-in-Chief of GlobalData's Energy Titles. In this podcast, we deliver strategic, actionable insights for energy industry professionals across the value chain. Each episode will be digging into the forces shaping power, oil and gas, and mining, bringing together expert voices and data-driven insights powered by GlobalData's world-class datasets and analysis. You might already know our journalism through our energy titles, power technology, offshore technology, and mining technology. This podcast builds on that reporting, but in a friendly audio format for anyone who wants to get the latest updates about the industry scroll-free. I'm joined on this podcast by our oil and gas editor, who you'll be hearing from regularly.
Hi, I'm Eve Thomas, editor of Offshore Technology, and I'll focus on what's happening across oil and gas.
And for our first episode, we're starting with a big one. 1 year into his second term, how has President Donald Trump reshaped the power and oil and gas sectors? Let's start with power. Donald Trump's return to the White House in January last year marked a decisive shift in energy policy for the U.S., with climate emission taking a backseat in favor of speed, reliability, and national security. At the heart of this shift are data centers. Trump has been unequivocal about expanding domestic digital infrastructure, and James Roth, head of policy at Bloom Energy, who previously served in the executive office of the president under the Clinton and Bush administrations, says this ambition has rippled across energy policy.
There have been some executive orders. It sort of talks about treating energy infrastructure as a core asset of the data center project. I think that anytime sort of the White House issues that kind of an edict, my experience is it sort of is a signal to federal and state regulators that they should sort of enact policies or regulations that are consistent with that.
That signal has been felt everywhere, but so have Trump's tariffs. Over the past year, average effective U.S. tariff rates have climbed around 15%, reaching levels not seen in decades, and key energy equipment and components have been caught in the crossfire. GlobalData estimates that the 50% tariffs on steel, aluminum, and copper increased overall project costs for U.S. power generation assets by 6 to 11% across different scenarios. Here to help unpack this is Rehaan Shiledar, Senior Power Analyst at GlobalData. Welcome, Rehaan.
Hi, Jackie. Glad to be joining. So, while the US goal from its trade policies was to stimulate domestic manufacturing, the immediate effect has been a disruption of established supply chains and higher prices for essential components and materials for US energy. Solar and battery storage experienced the most pressure because the US relies overwhelmingly on foreign suppliers for these technologies. But the effects have been felt all across the system, including parts favored by Trump, like gas power.
Well, let's dissect Trump's impact on each technology, starting with renewables. To no one's surprise, the first year of Trump's second term saw federal support for renewable energy weaken. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act accelerated the end of eligibility for clean electricity production and investment tax credits, grant programs have been scaled back, offshore wind leasing has been paused. On top of all this, tariffs are making projects more costly. What have been the repercussions?
Trump's energy policies have indeed hindered the US renewable energy sector and are seen as backfiring due to missed economic opportunities and potential energy grid instability. But among his numerous actions, it is tariffs that have caused the most severe blow to the sector. Over the past year, we witnessed Trump imposing tariffs on nearly all its trading partners, including China, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, South Korea, India, and the European Union, which supply essential components and raw materials for US solar and wind. Consequently, the cost of imported inputs increased, thereby raising overall project expenditures, delaying deployment timelines, and pushing many developers to renegotiate or cancel contracts. According to GlobalData analysis, US utility-scale solar project costs rose 20 to 54% as a result of tariffs, and for US onshore wind projects, around 9%. As for offshore wind, it has been the most direct target of the president's personal antipathy and policy reversals. Last year, multiple large-scale projects were ordered to stop work or undergo new, sudden reviews based on claims of national security risk or harm to marine life, despite prior studies. These actions have created significant uncertainty, delayed projects, and damaged investor confidence, with several projects already being cancelled as a result. The administration argues that they will accelerate domestic manufacturing and it has seen significant growth. But the US still lacks sufficient upstream capabilities, and without complementary industrial policies, tariff-induced reshoring remains expensive and slow.
What does all this mean for the trajectory of solar and wind in the US?
Well, despite tariffs and supply chain tensions in 2025, renewables kept expanding because their underlying economics and policy support are now deeply entrenched. Wind and solar remain among the cheapest new power sources, and long term policy frameworks like the Inflation Reduction Act, even as Trump has been rolling back aspects of it, support durable project pipelines in the long term.
Moving on to energy storage, you mentioned earlier that batteries were severely hit by tariffs. Can you elaborate?
Yes, China supplies a considerable share of the lithium ion utilized in battery production in the US. The tariffs on lithium ion batteries steal critical minerals like graphite, cobalt, nickel, lithium, copper, and aluminum significantly increase the cost of US energy storage systems, which can hinder further investment. GlobalData projects costs for US grid scale battery systems to have increased 12 to 50% from tariffs.
At the same time, storage has largely been spared from shifts in energy policy under Trump. While renewable tax credits in the IRA were rolled back, those for standalone storage remain intact through the mid-2030s. Plus, storage is critical in managing spikes in power demand, today mainly coming from data centers, which we know Trump adamantly supports, especially as the grid struggles to keep up.
Yes, that's true. That's why, given these dynamics, the outlook is still positive. Despite the tariffs headwinds, US battery storage surpassed 40 gigawatt in operational capacity in 2025, and it remains to be the country's fastest growing grid resource in the next decade. Especially if Trump wants data center expansion, the growth of the energy storage market is inevitable. Trade measures may have hindered the rate of growth, but the growth itself isn't in question.
Speaking of beneficiaries from Trump's data center ambitions, we can't leave out nuclear power. Data centers have spotlighted nuclear more than ever, given their compatibilities and load profiles. Here to speak on Trump's support of the sector is Henry Preston from the World Nuclear Association.
So back in May, he set an overall goal to quadruple nuclear by 2050. So that's around 400 gigawatts, going from 100 gigawatts today. And he set out the sort of three executive orders were around re-establishing the US as a global leader in nuclear energy. So to reinvigorate their industrial base, reform reactor testing, and reform regulatory commission. And I think it might be from the outside easy to think this is less international, but there's still many bilateral agreements with the US, with the likes of Canada on regulation in building the first Western SMR at Darlington. You've got South Korea and Japan, which had agreements on manufacturing heavy components for reactors. And then you've seen agreements between the US and the UK on advanced fuels and reactor designs as well.
Has Trump's approach been a break from the past?
Under Trump, it's a kind of a different sort of mechanism in that Trump has looked to accelerate nuclear support through executive orders, but not necessarily completely different. I think it's more of a continuation of the previous administration support for nuclear.
So, under any administration, do you think we would have seen something similar?
Yeah, I think so. To be clear, the US has bipartisan support for nuclear. So we saw in the previous administration under Biden, there was the Inflation Reduction Act, which brought in loads of investment support for nuclear. The US was a leader in coordinating the declaration to triple global nuclear capacity through the COP process alongside the UAE, France, Korea, the UK. The thing that we're seeing in the energy landscape is you've got a demand for energy, particularly in the US and in Europe, which is increasing from things like AI. And then you've got the energy security angle, which before 2021, with the invasion of Ukraine, there wasn't so much emphasis on security. And then you've got this reliability factor. There's been build out of renewables, which is very positive on the climate front, but it has shown intermittency and less resilience in grids around the world. So it's those three things that have really come to the fore.
Thanks, Preston.
Absolutely. No, it's good to chat.
Now, last but not least, let's touch on thermal power. Rehaan, what has been Trump's approach to the sector during his first year back in office?
In addition to security and reliability, as Preston highlighted, speed has become a keyword for the US energy priorities, and Trump's speed-focused energy approach centers around expediting the permitting and approval timelines for energy infrastructure, especially oil, natural gas, and coal projects, by streamlining environmental reviews and reducing regulatory friction. Data centers come into play, with the administration highlighting thermal power as a way to meet their demand. They've even issued emergency orders to keep online coal plants that were due to retire. And with Trump's pro-fossil fuel policies in place, it is both more economical and, from a clearances perspective, easier to roll out gas-based projects for data centers.
And even with tariffs, the sector was exempt. No tariffs have been applied to crude oil, natural gas, or refined fuel imports. But has that made the sector immune to tariffs then?
No, tariffs on imported steel, copper, and aluminum, which fossil developers still rely on for rigs, pipelines, compressors, and so on, have increased the cost of equipment for thermal power plants, making new construction and maintenance more expensive. Business sentiment in these sectors remain positive, but this can act as a disincentive for new investment while simultaneously driving up consumer electricity prices.
That makes sense. Not a straightforward picture, it seems. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Rehaan.
Thanks, Jackie.
Now, our offshore editor will expand further on Trump's impact on U.S. oil and gas. Passing it to you, Eve.
Thanks, Jackie. Trump's campaign was characterised by the words drill, baby, drill. So, from the very beginning of Trump 2.0, oil and gas has had a seat at the top table. On Inauguration Day, Trump ordered an immediate review of all agency actions which could be potentially burdening the development of domestic energy resources. He ordered that particular attention be given to oil and natural gas, alongside coal, biofuels, critical minerals, and nuclear energy. Note, of course, the absence of solar and wind. If the administration's rhetoric around oil and gas wasn't already clear enough, in March 2025, Lee Zeldin, the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, declared a reconsideration of regulations throttling the oil and gas industry on what he called the greatest day of deregulation our nation has seen. Fast forward 4 months and the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was signed. It included an offshore lease plan offering 36 oil and gas licenses, 30 in the Gulf of Mexico and 6 in Alaska's Cook Inlet. Certainly then, deregulation and licence policy changes have been an instrument of change under Trump. We've got GlobalData senior analyst Paul Hasselbrink here to explain. Paul, what's happening in the regulation, or should I say deregulation space?
Hi, Eve. Thanks for having me. So the regulatory and policy changes can be split into 3 generally. First is the permitting and environmental review reform, then leasing and drilling permitting, and also the emissions and climate regulations. Probably most impactful is the upcoming rollback of the National Environmental Policy Act, known as NEPA, which provided a framework and oversight body for assessing impacts of major projects. This was preceded by several executive orders and the, of course, One Big Beautiful Bill Act, introducing expedited environmental permitting. In terms of leasing, the administration repealed Biden-era bans on offshore drilling lands and reinstated revoked leases in protected areas in Alaska and also lifted LNG export pauses. This has resulted in 55% increase of drilling permits in the first year of this administration.
Thanks, Paul. Interestingly though, more drilling permits haven't yet translated to more drilling. The US rig count stood at 544 in November 2025, a decline of 38 compared to the year previously. In oil specifically, recent data from Baker Hughes showed that there were 407 rigs, down from 477 the year before, a decline of 15%. I recently chatted to Robert Kaufmann, Professor of Environmental Science at Boston University, to find out what's going on with US rigs.
So he's trying to reduce regulations that in theory should increase drilling, but at the same time his tariff policies, his trade policies are generating a lot of uncertainty, which is reducing drilling. And so those two have kind of been in conflict, and at the same time you have uncertainty about the economic situation. Is it really getting worse? If it is, that's going to soften oil prices. So it has been a slight decline in price, but overall it's kind of a wash because of these very many conflicting issues.
Indeed, prices have been going down, spurred by an overall global oil glut. You might think that less drilling and lower prices would indicate, or at least prompt, a point of slowed production. But that hasn't been the case. Instead, US crude oil production reached a record high in September 2025 at 13.84 million barrels per day compared to 13.17 million the year before. Let's hear Robert's explanation.
The rig count and production do not move in tandem. And so what's happened is the increase in production is a couple of things. You're seeing that the lagged effect of higher rig counts. So wells that were drilled, 6 months ago, a year ago, are now coming online. And also at the same time, new rig productivity, that is how productive a new rig is, has increased. And so even though the rig count can be down, you can be drilling more wells more effectively.
Rigs and regulations aside, we've got to talk about Trump's favourite word, and more specifically its absence in oil and gas. As Jackie mentioned, no tariffs have been applied to crude oil, natural gas or refined fuel imports. The US is the world's biggest refiner of petroleum products worldwide, producing around 18.4 million barrels per day in 2024. It has 131 operable refineries, primarily on the Gulf Coast, but to refine a lot, you need a lot of feedstock. For this, the US is dependent on imports. In 2023, it imported around 8.51 million barrels per day from 86 countries. The biggest providers were Canada, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Iraq and Brazil, countries that have faced significant tariffs under the current administration, but whose oil and gas can still be imported tariff-free. The story's not that simple, however, and the oil and gas sector's feedstock exemption hasn't made it immune to the sting of the Trump tariffs. Paul, can you tell us more?
Regardless of which specific product it is levied on, tariffs and general trade uncertainty are hurting the economic prospects far more and is causing far more damage to the industry than any individual cost hike associated to tariff levies, as demand for energy falls and so do their revenues. For the sector, though, the most impactful and harmful individual tariff would have been on imported steel, which impacts machinery and infrastructure costs across the supply chain, from drilling to pipelines to LNG and refineries.
Indeed, in June 2025, Trump increased the tariff rate for steel and aluminium from 25% to 50%. Accounting firm EY estimates that steel comprises around 10% of manufacturing costs in oil and gas. And of course, higher costs mean lower profit margins. There are still plenty of pain points for oil and gas then, even with Trump in the White House. However, there is also significant industry optimism. The president wants to supercharge the industry by removing regulations, incentivizing exploration and drilling, and boosting refineries. Following the previous Biden administration, which introduced a now overturned offshore drilling ban, Trump's aptitude for volatility must seem the lesser of two evils. Any final thoughts to add, Paul?
Now, the administration's endgame is seemingly beyond just growing the nominal number of barrels produced. It is more about having sufficient tools in an unburdened industry to be able to ramp up production when needed and be able to use primary energy production as leverage in international relations. The slowdown of fossil fuel demand globally and the emergence of competition in the LNG space, as well as a very solid OPEC, actually undermines the potential benefits of the whole deregulation agenda to achieve quote-unquote energy dominance.
Well, that's your whirlwind tour of offshore developments under Trump. But as we know, the US president keeps everyone on their toes, and there will doubtless be more surprises ahead.
Alright, that's it for today's episode of Energy Technology. Find more news and insights into all things energy on power technology, offshore technology, and mining technology, all free to access. For quick daily updates, make sure to subscribe to our newsletters. I'm Jackie Park, and we'll see you next week.